All right.
Excellent. So good evening, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Make sure we get that up and going. All right. Does everyone see the PowerPoint, the wonderful PowerPoint that we got for today? Thumbs up. Awesome.
Yep.
Excellent. So just to kick us off, I just want to say, Robert and everyone, thank you so much for taking the time this evening to meet with us. We're going to have a couple of great topics today. So for my topic, I'm going to be talking about my Cisco DevNet journey. Right. So as we know, Cisco rolled out these new certifications, primarily around Cisco DevNet, programmability, and it sounds cool and all, but I wanted today just to kind of talk about what does that look like, right? What sort of experience are you going to look into? What kind of best tips, best practices that I can provide in case this is something that you want to look into. So before I actually go into the PowerPoint, I have a quick little activity that I wanted to do for everybody. Let's flip over. Actually, next slide. All right, so I want everyone to take out their phones. You can either take out your phone or open up a new tab. And I want you to go to menti.com. And then you're going to be given a prompt to enter the code. The code is on the slide in case you need to see it. So menti.com. And then you should be given a couple of questions. Yeah, and basically, I just went over and pivoted over to the questions. So I'm going to ask everyone a couple of questions, just to kind of understand, kind of get some context on what everyone's feelings are around programmability, DevNets, and then what I'll also do at the end of the presentation is include everyone's input. So really curious to see what you guys have to say about some of the questions. So to kick us off, what does programmability mean to you? All right, we got calculator. So it's been a couple minutes. Okay, wow. All right, Python, less prone to error. Cool, fast. All right, a lot of API is a good one. Flexibility is a good one. All right. Got some more pouring in. All right, efficiency, coding. All right, it's been another couple of seconds here. Automate, that's a good one too. Looks like automation is the key word here we're seeing. All right. Someone wrote cow. I guess that's don't know where cow falls into place, but all right, cool. Cat. Cats are cool. Dogs are cool. All right, excellent. So it looks like everyone got an idea. Looks like automation is one of the big words here. Software defined, I'm seeing some good ones. Network automation, Python being one of those keywords. Excellent, cool. So it looks like we got a good amount of context here. So now I'm going to pivot over to the second question. Let's see, minimize. The second question is Cisco DevNet. So what is it? So when you hear Cisco DevNet, what are some of those things that first come to your mind when you first hear about Cisco DevNet? Marketing, all right. It's a good one. Developers Network, Sandbox, learning, certifications, free training. Ansible is a good one. Development community, certification. All right. Awesome. Well, all right, so I just want to say, I think it looks like everyone on this call basically summarized all the topics that I wanted into this word cloud, so I think I'm done for tonight. Nah, all good. It's all good. So appreciate everyone for taking the time to go through this. I just wanted to kind of capture everyone's opinions and thoughts around it, so I can kind of add some color, add some context around today's presentation. So just to kind of set the tone for today's agenda, first topic is show run, right? What does show run have to do with this conversation? So basically, I want to talk about my config, right? My background, talk about how I went through my journey as an engineer to kind of understand where does programmability fit into what I like to do and how it basically enabled me to start into the DevNet track. Second, I want to talk about Cisco's pivot point. Cisco has always been a traditional hardware company, right? But what was I would say the pivot point that made them realize, oh, programmability is that next thing. What do we need to do to get on it? And then, of course, I'll talk about the certifications, some of the resources that helped me achieve the cert at a high level. And then lastly, I'll talk about DevNet and you. What did DevNet do to impact my role as an engineer? And how could it also kind of think about what you can do in terms of your everyday use cases around your network, your programmability skill set, etc. And then, of course, we have some time for Q&A. But of course, throughout this whole presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to hop on mute and ask. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. So a little bit about my background. So as you all know, I'm Joe Mejica. I am an SE with Robert's team. So in my previous experience, I started off at Cisco as a customer support engineer with our CX organization for about a year and a half. And then I decided to move over to the pre-sale side as an associate systems engineer. Currently, I live in Irvine, California, but I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. So I went from the East Coast to the West Coast to live, the Southern California dream. A little about my education, went to Georgia State University with a computer science degree. And throughout my tenure at Cisco, I went through, I would say, a good bit of the certification track. CCNA Collab, CCNP routing and switching, and then more recently, the DevNet Certs. But I would say, let's go a little bit deeper in terms of like why this influenced my overall track when it comes to DevNet. So show run, everyone's favorite. I think it's the only CLI command I can remember off the top of my head. I feel like everyone in this room always remembers show run, right? When in doubt, show run. So show run for me, this is my config, right? So basically what helped me influence my config and how I operate that helped me understand this is why I want to go into the DevNet track. So as you all know, I studied computer science, a lot of coffee, a lot of Googling, a lot of Stack Overflow, right? Just to help me understand programmability in a sense. And ironically, when it came to figuring out what I wanted to do with my career, it was always the default that if you did computer science, you were going to be a software engineer. Well, guess what? I wasn't the best programmer, actually. I was actually pretty bad at it at first. I was like, really struggling with it, but I really wanted to stick with it because I had a feeling that it would be really important down the line. So then as I went through, my college journey and stuff, I just found ways to code. Whether, it's automating simple things, building websites for people, I just really wanted to stick to that skill set. But ironically, I didn't do anything around network programmability yet. And then I started my role at Cisco. I worked with our managed services part of the business, basically managing these things, our IP phones, right? So everything from, managing call manager, resolving technical support issues with our phone systems, that's basically what I did. So that was around 2017. And around that time, that's when Cisco really started to look into the programmability space. We hear Python, network programmability, a lot of those keywords that you all mentioned in the first word cloud. And then it started a uproar. We need to learn Python. We need to automate everything. We need to X, Y, Z, right? But what does that actually mean? Does it mean I have to learn Python? Does it mean I have to go back to school to be a good programmer? Do I have to learn a whole new tool? It was basically a huge web of, figuring out what we need to do in that space. And then, as I went throughout my career, there's an opportunity. And I think I want everyone to start thinking about this, right? What can you do with programmability to start creating opportunities for you, as engineers to really start bringing that value? So one analogy that I like to, live by is small ripples make huge waves, right? So on the next slide, I'm actually going to bring you in on a little secret, which is actually one of the very first scripts I actually wrote during my time at Cisco that really just helped really bring this, into fruition, right? From studying computer science to not being the best programmer to finding ways to stay in touch with it to actually creating a script that helped my team out. So I just want to kind of show you guys what that example script looks like. And it's actually a very primitive example of what you can do. So of course we have CLI, right? We would go into a router or switch, we would SSH into it. I need to check whether it's an interface or a VLAN, right? And then we have basically, I would say, the typical runbook, which is, get the IP of the address, SSH, username, password, input the command. You got to read through the whole CLI. I think when I first did it, it was pretty cool, right? But then you realize that can take some time. 3 or 4 minutes later, like you can be the best person behind the keyboard and run CLI commands all day, but imagine doing this to scale. think about how much time that you could save if there was a way to automate this, if there was a way to simplify. I mean, I can't tell you how many times that I would fat finger a command or do something and it would totally ruin my day, right? So what if there was a way to simplify this runbook in a script? And I kind of want to show you what that looks like. So working in collaboration, one of the things that I had to do was checking a SIP trunk status, right? So on a high level, what I did was I took a lot of those redundant commands and dumped it in a Python script. This script may not be the most, beautiful looking script. It probably had a lot of errors, probably had a lot of logic that could have been implemented to improve it, but it provided value. Instead of having my teammates always having to go through those redundant tasks, I delivered, hey, here's a Python script that you all can run to do this one task, and it will save you time. And because of this, because of this very basic, simple use case of automation using Python, it allowed my team to really realize, one, that programmability is something that we all need to consider. Two, it was a way to bring, like I said, bring value to the team. And three, a way to really start being future oriented, right? Start thinking about what do we need to do to not only bring the way that we think, the way that we work, but the way we structure our products to kind of fit into this new pivot points. And speaking of pivot points, I want to talk about that. So Cisco Live has always been, the grand event where we announce a lot of new products, a lot of new services, but it was Cisco Live of 2019 in San Diego. Okay, so that one was a very interesting one because not only did announce some really cool stuff, but there was something called quote unquote Certpocalypse. I'm sure everyone's heard of Certpocalypse, but just to kind of give you a rundown. So all those certifications that we had, the CCNA, CCNP, CCIE, they all went through a complete revision. They went basically a lot of the older topics, they revised it to newer ones that made sense. And then it caused a lot of ruckus of how are we going to handle that? But on top of that, they added in the DevNet certifications. And then which also brought in the era of DevNet. So what exactly is DevNet? Like you all said, DevNet is marketing. DevNet is a community, a learning resource. And that's exactly, what DevNet aimed to do, right? So as soon as they announced the new certifications, Cisco really wanted DevNet to not just be a place where you can get these new certifications, but to really capture that pivot point for everyone on this call, everyone outside of this call, to really embrace programmability. And I think one of the beautiful things about programmability is that, like this quote says, everyone is a developer if they have the right tools, right? So with Cisco and DevNet, what we're able to do is we're able to basically create this huge resource repository made up with a lot of other engineers, like-minded, like everyone on this call, to basically start thinking about that pivot point, right? Start thinking about that future-oriented approach of using programmability. So you have everything such as, you have learning labs that are free. You have a growing member base. One big thing is the code exchange. So let's say you're starting to write code, or not even starting to write code, but if you want to start borrowing people's code, like we're all a collaborative effort in this, to basically start implementing into your environment, they have that available. And then of course the certification track. But one thing I also want to highlight when it comes to programmability, and I hear this a lot, is like, man, I don't know. But I would say my biggest piece of advice when you're really starting to look into not just programming, but DevNet in general, is align it with your interests. One thing that DevNet really did a good job about, it wasn't just something around like, Meraki or DNA Center. It's geared towards every piece of a Cisco architecture. So whether you are a data center engineer that wants to start dabbling in it, we have topics for you. If you're someone that is, really wanting to get into security, there's going to be a learning lab, there's going to be code, there's a lot of resources available for you and across the other architectures. So before I continue on talking about the certifications, did anyone have any questions of DevNet in general? Are we good to go? Does anyone have any questions on it? All right, cool. So moving on, let's go on quickly talk about the certs. All right. So like the traditional certification track, we had the CCNA, the CCNP, the specialist, and the CCIE. So when it came to DevNet, we had basically a mirror approach. We have an associate level, specialist, professional, and soon to be releasing an expert level. So basically like a CCIE DevNet certification. So, and what they did, not just with the DevNet track, but with the Cisco track, is they really made sure to cater each tier to build off each other, right? So, and I'll talk about that in a later slide, but basically each of these certifications are built off one another to not only cater to your growing skill set, but to also specifically target, your specialty, your orientation when it comes to what you interact with. Let's talk about the certs. So the DevNet Associate, I would say that's your entryway. That's your entryway into understanding not just programmability, but understanding how does it tie into Cisco and just other products in general, right? So think about it more like, that analogy, where rubber meets the road, right? So the DevNet Associate is basically, what's that road? Where is that road that I need to travel on, right? So it's more of just like understanding the product, understanding where programmability fits into this. And then the DevNet specialist exam, that's your next year. Basically, that is where you'd want to really start looking into a specialist track. Like, for example, if you are someone that is really geared towards security, right? If you want to know more about our security products and how we go about the automation piece of that, there's going to be a cert for you. If you want to look into IoT, WebEx, there's going to be a cert for you. So and that's great because now you're not tied to a specific track. So for example, like if you're really strong in a certain topic, go with that topic that you're strong in. And then next is DevNet Professional. So DevNet Professional is basically, going back to where the rubber meets the road, associate being that road, specialist building the track tires, right, the rubber. And then DevNet Professional, that's where the rubber meets the road. Basically, that's where we're talking about taking all the skills of, first off with the associate, knowing about programmability, like kind of getting that baseline understanding. Specialist, being a little bit more deeper on a certain topic. And then professional, taking all of those practical skills and basically creating a platform or an application geared towards a specific use case that you may have. And then with the DevNet Expert certification, more information is going to be released, but I specifically wanted to talk about the associate, specialist, and professional. So what did I do? I talked about, what DevNet is at a high level. I talked about the certifications, but now I want to go and talk about my use case specifically. So I did the associate exam. I went with the core and the enterprise automation exam because I had a background in terms of our enterprise networking portfolio. And then I went for the professional exam. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about, at a high level, what are some of those key and primary topics that you would want to consider in terms of, going towards the certifications. So trivia or practical knowledge. So before I even talk about this, when I took, for example, like the CCNP route switch, the old exam, and feel free to chime in on this too, but I think one of the things that I personally didn't like about those exams was a lot of the trivia-based questions. Frame relay. I have never personally dealt with frame relay, but good Lord, I had so many questions on frame relay that I was like, what is this, right? And just a lot of miscellaneous topics. And that was something that a lot of, in terms of feedback on the traditional certifications, was the fact that it was very trivial based. But then after getting a lot of the feedback, Cisco decided to, like I said, revamp their certifications and become more practical in what you do. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some of those key things that that each exam that I took kind of highlighted in terms of helping me understand this. So the associate exam, we talked about the basic concepts. You hear Agile, you hear basic programmability, formatting, design. APIs, we hear application programming interface. What does it mean? What's really good about the DevNet Associate exam? It kind of goes over like how an API really works. Like, what does it mean? Is it just a buzzword that we just throw in front of, customers, et cetera? No, it's a way for different applications to communicate and et cetera. A high-level understanding of Cisco's portfolio in the programmability space, right? So we have our routers, we have our switches, we have our data center, and collaboration technology, but how does it all actually work in terms of the programmability space? That's one thing that the DevNet Associate really highlights in terms of understanding at a high level how does it all integrate. And then later this evening we have Danny who's going to talk about Ansible. So things such as Ansible, Puppet, Chef, a lot of those other automation tools. It's a really good way to understand those basics as well. And then of course, like if you're looking at the certifications, also learn network fundamentals. Like for example, if you're someone who is going from 0 to Cisco, this would be a good exam because it actually covers some of those basic networking fundamentals as well. So I guess one thing to highlight throughout the process is, even though it is a programmability centric exam track, we still have the bread and butter of all that is Cisco, right? So your basic networking knowledge, your protocols, etc. It's still in there because we definitely don't want to neglect those basics. Next is that EN Auto, so the Enterprise Networking Automation exam. So a couple of things I want to highlight, DNA Center, SD-WAN, Meraki. So as of right now, those are probably the top 3 in terms of the programmability concepts that we offer in terms of the certification track. So one thing that the EN Auto exam did a really good job about is taking those basics, the basics that I talked about, and then starting to apply it. You're not building an application, but you're applying it to actual products. So how do we write code? How do we understand code to actually start automating the products that I mentioned? As well as kind of finding ways to optimize APIs, protocols, etc. But then another thing I want to highlight too is if you're looking at, for example, your CCNP certification, you can look into that as a way. You can also use your EN Auto exam to be eligible for your CCNP Enterprise Cert as well. And last is DevCore. So DevCore is I would say the last exam I took. So the last exam that you can take to become Devnet Professional, right? So exam 1 to get your DevNet Associate, exam 2 to be eligible to get either the CCNP Enterprise or the Devnet Professional, and then DevCore being the last exam that you want to take to basically seal the deal. So like I said, you're building a track, right? So everything from exam 1, getting a high level understanding of the concepts, exam 2, starting to apply it in terms of actual product, actual infrastructure, exam 3, tying it all together to basically start building these applications, right? So applications, optimizing your APIs, as well as also adding other tiers of products, whether it be WebEx, UCS, App Dynamics, finding ways to really starting to bring that to the equation. And then like I talked about with the exam 1, Ansible, right? We didn't forget about it. We're still going to bring in Ansible and other automation platforms, just so that way, we're not just covering a development standpoint, but more of an infrastructure management standpoint. And then I would say, like, after going through all 3 of these exams, like, like when you first go through it, it can seem very daunting at first, right? Then one of the questions I usually get is like, do you have to write a lot of code? And do I have to spend tons and tons of hours building applications? And the answer is no. Going through and you're building these topics for you to really understand what programmability means in this space. And before I move on, the next thing I'm going to talk about is, I guess, some of the high level understanding of the different resources. Did anyone have any questions on the 3 exams that I took in terms of my perspective? All right, cool. So tools of the trade. So what do we have out there that you can readily use today to help you prepare for these certifications? So we have each Cisco exam, we have an exam blueprint, right? And what the exam blueprint offers basically gives you a breakdown of the different topics that you are to be expecting of each category that you see on an exam. And one thing that I can say from my experience is the exam blueprint, it's true to form. You're not going to get any surprises. You're not going to get, like I said, those frame relay questions. Basically, if you study to the exam blueprint, you're going to be fine, right? You're not going to get any surprises. What you see is what you get, which is a good thing, because that way you're not, wasting time studying on a certain topic. Like you're actually allocating the right amount of time and weight for a certain topic to help you understand your study track. Videos. So I'm a visual learner. So in terms of videos that are available, we have CPT Nuggets, Pluralsight, YouTube, and the DevNet library offers a good amount of videos. So whatever works for you, we have a lot of videos centered around the DevNet certifications and what it has to offer. Labs. After going through the videos, one thing I recommend is labbing, right? So actually starting to put this into practice. So the DevNet Sandbox is a really good way to get started. They have everything from tutorials on how to structure code, how to actually understand the product, as well as the Cisco Learning Library. It's another resource that not only has videos, but it's a way for you to start applying this knowledge in terms of a track, in terms of understanding how to bring it all together. Last thing is documentation, right? So of course, we're all used to reading data sheets and all that stuff, but then what about these product API documentations, right? When you first look at it, it can be confusing, right? But one thing that the DevNet exam is really, really good at teaching is how to understand these documentation components, right? How do I read an API doc? How do I use it to write code? How do I use it to even talk about a certain product, right? That's one thing that it really helped articulate in terms of understanding that component. And then those automation tools, right? So as you go through these different automation tools that are out there, of course, I recommend looking at their respective documentation to kind of help fill in those gaps, right? So if I can just summarize, what I did to kind of go through the tools of the trade was I took a look at that exam blueprint, and then I, went through each topic one by one, and then I basically started watching a video for that topic, and if need be, lab it, and then documentation, right? And then as soon as I, basically compiled a notebook of everything I had, then I felt ready. It was game time. I felt ready to take the exam. So next thing I want to talk about is the actual exam experience. So I know with COVID-19, it's been hard to actually go into a testing site, right? A testing center to, go in, take an exam. I remember before you would just go in, have some headphones or earplugs in, and you take your exam at a testing site. But now Pearson, the company that hosts the exams, they're actually offering these exams online. So if you're looking at, whether it be the DevNet certifications or any of your traditional Cisco certs, you have the opportunity to take it online at home. So I kind of want to just take a few minutes to talk about that experience. So you go through the experience, you sign up for the exam, go through a check-in process, right? So you have to take, a couple photos of your desktop, your environment, just to be sure everything is all good to go. And then you have a proctor. So you have to turn on your webcam to make sure that, if your ID matches your face, they go through that check, and then you take your exam, right? Exam time, so the exam's about 2 hours long, and they vary in terms of question count, etc. But I think one thing I want to highlight is it can be kind of strict in terms of when you take these exams online. So don't cover your mouth. So I don't know about me, I don't know about everyone, but when I take exams, I like to do this just so I can think, right? It's like, is it A, is it B? So you will get nagged on for that. So you can't cover your mouth. You got to keep your eyes forward at all times. You can't murmur. So, I just kind of wanted to highlight some of those things in terms of like, it can be strict, but it's doable, right? And then there's a horror story. It didn't happen to me, but I heard it happen to someone where their Wi-Fi went out during the exam. I just want to let you know, like, if that happens, don't worry. We know things happen, but Pearson's really good at communicating with you. Like, if something were to happen to you during your exam, they'll simply call your number and say, hey, is everything fine? All right, cool, let's get you back started. So nothing to worry about. So I just really wanted to kind of give everyone, like, at least like a better understanding of what that online testing experience is like, right? So, you can't have water next to you. You can't have food next to you. I mean, you can have food, I would say, a little further out as inspiration for you to, knock out your exam and, all right, let's go eat some dinner. So, but, they go through the steps pretty well in terms of getting you ready for your exam experience. So we talked about, what DevNet is. We talked about the different certifications. We talked about the study resources. You've gone through the process. You've gone through the rigorous track, right? Now you've gotten your certifications, right? Great, I got my certification, but what's next? Now what? Like, what does this mean to you, and what does this mean to me? So I would say from my perspective, a couple things I wanted to highlight that I was able to get from the experience was, one, being able to have conversations around programmability, right? So programmability was always seen as, it's kind of like, I was in bowling club in high school, and I wasn't the best bowler, right? But programmability was a club, right? And you're like, how do I join that club? How do I understand what they do? And I want to be a part of that, right? So one thing that the DevNet certifications, like not even just going through the entire track, but even just going through the associate exam, is having those conversations, right? Being able to, talk to someone, what is an API? What does this mean for our products, right? Understanding what does code mean in general in terms of the automation standpoint. Next is better understanding of the market, right? So like I said, Cisco's pivot point was not only when they talked about DevNet, but software-defined networking as a whole. Understanding this is where a lot of our products are going. They're going towards automation, APIs, a lot of those keywords, right? But being able to understand that trajectory is important. The next is code and knowledge library, right? So as you go through your studies, you're gonna start accruing a bunch of code, a bunch of knowledge that you can start using, like reuse your code, reuse it to help a teammate out, reuse it to help bring forth an application or something, or a huge idea that can help everyone in your team. That's one thing that can be really helpful. And then lastly is those new out of the box ideas, right? So traditionally, if you think about, we come up with like, we presented a problem, right? If you think about it, it's like, all right, probably upgrading a router or upgrading a switch will do it, right? Think about it in terms of like hardware, right? But then what about the software piece? So being able to, like I said, have those conversations around programmability is going to help everyone unlock those new ideas. Maybe, hey, let's write a script to automate those tasks, or hey, we need to build a custom application to tie in, some of our infrastructure to do a certain XYZ, right? It can really start generating some of those out of the box ideas that like I mentioned, to really bring value. Like I said, find ways to bring an opportunity of value that you can bring to your team. And then lastly, I just want to talk about you on this call. What does this mean for you, right? So I talked about code a lot. I talked about programmability, but one thing, if there's anything I want everyone to get out of this call, is programmability does not equal code. You do not have to code to be a piece or become a part of programmability, right? Everyone's going to have a different use case. Like if you're someone that wants to be the resources, we have DevNet to give you those resources, right? Or you're looking into like solving those problems, right? Like you're always going to find someone that knows how to code, right? But what about you? Like, could you be someone that either is that person that codes, or am I going to be the person that can kind of understand where this can fit into the equation and how it can solve problems, right? So, as you think about, as I, think about this with everyone, like start thinking about where this can fit into what you do every day, right? Whether it be, using Ansible to, help with infrastructure, whether it be using some of the resources that we have at DevNet. Like you don't even have to go through the certification track, but having these resources available is basically what we really wanted to capture with DevNets and with everyone today. So just to kind of summarize some of those key points, DevNet as a culture, right? So like I said, it's a huge shift from going from traditional CLI to .py, right? Using a Python script to start running automating tasks, but using programmability to solve problems. With Cisco are aligned with a lot of the skills that are in demand. You're going to be quizzed on, like I said, those trivial things, but really start feeling enabled whenever you finish your exams. You're placing programmability. I think if anything, start thinking about, where does this fit into what I do every day and how can I bring it to my team? And like I said, small ripples make big waves, right? So whether you decide to, write some code tomorrow, or you decide to, go to the DevNet website and start looking at some of those resources, you are starting that journey, right? I talked about my journey as a CS student that didn't do any network programmability, but then all of a sudden got into it because I wanted to bring value, right? That can be your use case, but your use case in particular will be different. But all I can say is whatever you decide to do to step into the programmability space, it's going to make a big impact as long as you stick along with it. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Did anyone have any questions, concerns, or anything that I can help with?
So for folks on the call, remember I put you guys on mute, but you can definitely come off of mute and ask questions.
I'm very basic with it. Steve, I have a very basic question.
Yeah.
Using programmability, this is like an active polling tool. You're writing code and then running it against a router. I'm playing devil's advocate when I ask this question, but because you're doing that, you're doing there's something that we've been using for a long time, EEM, which is passive, which I don't have to even poll a router. The router sends me an email saying my serial interface is down right now, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the programmability work in the larger context? If you're writing a program, and is it a one-time deal, or is it in a shell, or how does it work in a larger context of I poll once every minute or once every 60 minutes to say, is your serial interface down? So that's kind of devil's advocate.
Got it. Yeah. So when it comes to programmability, I guess in that regard, like it can be anything, right? So when I say anything, it can be either like that one-time script, like in a shell that you mentioned. Like for example, like if it's just that one-off use case, right? You can write a script around it. But then in terms of a larger sense, right? So for example, like if you're working with a platform that has a programmability piece tied to it, then you can either write a custom application to, let's say, gather or pull certain data. You can also find different ways to visualize. I think one thing that a lot of our applications are doing is finding different ways to visualize and understand data better, right? So of course you can look at, for example, like your interface is up, interface is down, but what other pieces of that can we, use programmability to kind of extract from? To, I guess, create a new like way of looking at things, right? Let's see, another thing that you can think about too. But yeah, that's like it's a really broad, I guess, answer, right? Because it really, I hate saying it, but it really just depends, right? Depends on like your use case that you want to solve, the scope that you want to look into, but it's really ultimately how you want to approach it. But there's different avenues of how you want to take it.
Hey, Steve, this is Jason. Long time no talk. I'll also take a swipe at that because one really significant difference, and I say this as an EM advocate, EM is that's a point solution. The only thing that runs on is a Cisco iOS router that has the proper iOS that runs EM. So you're not going to run that if you're running, say, SD-WAN. You're not going to run that on your call manager. You're not going to run that on anything other than a point product, right? And the only thing that the EM can do is, well, that's not true, but its main focus, I guess I should say, is mostly operational. Like you said, is an interface up or down, have interface error counters incremented or decremented, has my CPU spiked, right? Things like that, which are very operational. When you're talking about something like this, it could absolutely be operational in the same sense. But it could be things like, hey, every morning at 6 a.m., I'm going to go run a script that goes out and inventories all my devices because we're in the middle of a merger and acquisition. I want to make sure that the project team actually brought all the new sites up online for this M&A that they were supposed to last night. And if not, dump that into a CSV so I can take it to the project management team to kind of deal with or something. Honestly, I think Joe's got it right when he says, honestly, when it comes to broader programmability, the only thing that limits us, and this limits me more than anyone on this call, is our imagination. So EM is great. And I've done quite a few, I've done several talks on EM for the SCUG group, for example, including labs and everything else. And I'm a big fan of EM. But this is so much broader. It's really an apples and oranges sort of scenario, I think, in my opinion.
I got another question, maybe a little bit of a layup for Joe, but let's say, Joe, you have 100 different routers out in the field, and you do need to run an EEM script. What's the most efficient way to push that script out and get it configured? Or maybe this one's for Daniel. That might be a little bit more appropriate, but I think my point was EEM, programmability, all these tools here, they're part of a tool set, right? So use them where appropriate.
Yeah, so if I could jump in, let's think of it this way. So EEM is great, but with programmability, what you could do is, you mentioned you get an alert when an interface goes down using EEM. Imagine that alert can trigger a script that changes configuration on a remote device, which then updates your routes remotely on another site. So it can either add or remove a route, change administrative distance based on your EEM trigger. Yeah, you could also use automation to configure EEM on hundreds of devices at the same time, because you're looking for a particular interface to go up or down. Rather than go out and configure those manually, you can use automation to just update your EEM or configure it however you'd like. So EEM is a great tool, but by itself, it's good, but you can also tie it in with automation to be a lot more powerful.
Any other questions before we transition over to Daniel?
I apologize for playing devil's advocate on it, but I was seeing it in a particular light too. I think the other thing is that what Joe acknowledges is that this is kind of this giant umbrella kind of coverage that we're talking about. And I tend to think in very granular terms. So I'm thinking, oh, when Robert says, oh yeah, you can push out configs, that becomes a management aspect. Or if it's, oh, I see this interface go down, or I see this route go, then I can use it for, in a different kind of management context. So I'm trying to think in terms of those, like diagnostics. I was working with a group, and we had these wireless LAN controllers, Cisco wireless LAN controllers, that did not like Chromebooks at all. And we had tons of DHCP errors, and we went through holy hell for weeks and weeks. And I spent whole days on the phone with TAC trying to solve it. And I'm thinking, wow, if I had a script that could run and go pull this particular set of data that I needed, every 40 seconds for, a 60-minute window, and then be able to look at it, maybe I could parse it better, So I see the need, but I was kind of looking at it in the larger context of different needs and outside of the scope of what my thinking is. So.
Yeah, no worries. No, I mean, that's honestly like a good way of looking at it too, right? Because I think when I first got into it, right, it was, when I first wrote my first script, it was operational, right? Like up or down status, right? But like when you start really going into this, like you really start like looking at the different use cases. I think one thing I want to talk about too, right, is cross management, or like I would say cross platform, right? So like one use case is, let's say you have ServiceNow, for example, is one, right? So like, for example, you use ServiceNow as your ticketing system, right? So finding ways to, how do I, based on these alerts, create like a ticket in ServiceNow, right? Finding ways like that, or even things like WebEx Teams, right? Like, let's say we have that operational status, right? Let's use that to ping WebEx Teams. I got a notification. So kind of like also proactive, right? So a lot of these things that instead of just being reactive, being more proactive in your approach in terms of using code to look at things, for example, like in the operational sense, right? One use case I could think about is, for example, your phone system, right? Like during off-peak hours, like I just want to do a health check. Health checks being a really good automation case, right? So being able to, run health checks, then, okay, based on the results of the health check, oh, it looks like I need to, address a couple of things, either later today, later tonight. But, like I said, the sky is the limit with how you want to look at this, right? So I would say, you find ways to solve your problems first. And then like after you kind of get comfortable with it, then it's like, all right, let's start branching out. Let's start learning some new tricks to add to the tool set. Like,
Thanks, Joe.
no problem.
Great job. Okay, so with that, we're going to transition it over to Daniel Mendez. And Daniel, I'm going to hand you the ball. And you are now the presenter.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, Everyone can see? So I'm going to be talking about automation and specifically automation using Ansible. A little bit about me. I am a senior network programmability engineer with LA Networks. My background is mostly in enterprise networking, but for the past couple of years, I've been heavily concentrated in programmability. I've been writing automation scripts for about 4 or 5 years, primarily in Python. But recently I've been using Ansible for a few things. And I've also been encouraging my team to use Ansible because it's a pretty powerful language. I shouldn't really call it a language, but more of a framework. And I will give you a few reasons later on in this presentation about why I think Ansible is great to start out with. But first, let's take a look at the agenda. So I'm going to be talking about why you might want to be using automation and whether it's the right choice for you. In some cases, it may not be the right choice. We'll be talking about Ansible and a few of the components that make up Ansible. So inventories, playbooks, and then I'll just be showing you 2 or 3 demos about what we can do using Ansible and how you can build your own playbook. So with that, let's get started. So why automation? I think the first thing that we think of when we talk about automation is time and how it's going to help us save time. So how much time we actually save really depends on how big our network is and how often we're making these changes. So if you have one site with 3 or 4 devices, automation's probably not the best choice for you unless you're constantly making repetitive changes, in which case I'm not sure why, but you may have a reason to do that with 3 or 4 devices. I don't know. The next thing would be simplicity. And when I say simplicity, I'm not just talking about creating the program itself. I don't think any of us think creating programs or writing scripts is that simple. It's not that hard, and we'll show you later how easy it can be. But simplicity to me means creating standards or templates to use across your network. So having standardized configs can make it a lot easier to manage your network because you know what's going on across all your devices across your entire enterprise. Now, obviously, there's going to be one-offs here or there, but what we're aiming for is consistency. The next thing automation can help us do is reduce errors. So when there have been case studies when you're doing manual repetitive tasks, you're more likely to commit errors. So let's say we have somebody updating configuration because of some new security advisory that just came out. If we're working on updating configuration for a few hundred devices, we are more than likely going to commit a couple of errors. There have been plenty of times where I've even seen people make copy and pasting errors. I'm sure you have as well, where people are trying to paste in configuration to one device, and then they paste it into the wrong device. Hopefully they notice it before they actually paste it, but not all the time, and it's a nightmare when it happens. The other thing automation can help us do is gain visibility. So it can help us utilize our network as a sensor. So what we could do is we could write scripts to quickly extract data, just pieces of data that we might be looking for, like on a wireless controller, like Steve mentioned. We can write a script to just pull specific information and analyze that across other devices that are similar and across time. So we can obviously do that as humans. It's not difficult, but what automation can do is it can simplify that, make it faster, so we can solve problems a lot faster and make better use of our own time. So why Ansible when there's there's plenty of other tools like Puppet, Chef, Python. Ansible is easy to use. It's a lot easier than something like Python if you want to hit the ground running. So Python has a pretty steep learning curve, not as steep as some other languages, but it's definitely a lot steeper than Ansible. Ansible has a huge knowledge base. There's plenty of resources out there to get started and learn how to write your own scripts or playbooks. And people are sharing these playbooks as well, so you can take a look at theirs and kind of just modify it to your own needs. The other thing that Ansible is great for is consistency. So in my organization, like I said, I primarily write things in Python, but we have people that may be able to write things in Java. And if we are working on the same task and I am writing in Python and somebody else is writing in Java, we don't really understand each other. It's two different languages. So what he might have and what I might have, we can't really use in conjunction. So Ansible, since it's so easy to learn and use, is a great middle ground to have. So when you have multiple people writing programs across an organization, your goal is to be able to have that you can transfer from engineer to engineer and make it shareable. The other thing is, let's say I were to leave and I'm the only person that can write in Python. Well, then those scripts that I had created are now gone with me. Whereas if I had them in Ansible, it would be something anybody could pick up and read and understand. Last, Ansible has a huge library of modules. And we'll talk about what modules are, but basically you can think of them as pre-written scripts that are going to help us with certain tasks later on. So let's say I wrote a program to ping a few devices. Rather than writing that program to ping each time, we have a module that we can just call and it'll do that task for us. So the components of Ansible are as follows. Think of this diagram as kind of a Ansible box. That's going to be either local or in a cloud somewhere. There's kind of a lot here that's going on, but as the Ansible administrator, the only thing we have to really worry about is this stuff in purple. So the only things that we're going to be changing regularly are going to be the host file or the inventory file and the playbooks. The blue part is just going to be the core Ansible. That's the engine that takes the playbooks and runs it against whatever devices we want. The stuff in orange are the modules. Those are either provided by Ansible or by a third party. And the stuff in yellow, just think of those plugins as ways of how we're going to connect to endpoints. So we can either connect to network devices using APIs, or we can connect to them using SSH. That's what the connection plugins are. There's also plugins for things like how we want the results of playbooks to be sent to us. We could either have those results emailed to us, sent to a login server, or something else. So like I mentioned, network modules are an essential piece to Ansible. What these do is, like I mentioned, they're reusable pieces of code. And in our demo, we're going to be using 3 of the common Cisco modules, which are iOS command, iOS config, and iOS fax. Another way to think of these modules are ways that our playbooks or our program interprets what we're saying or what we're writing to the device we're trying to communicate with. So if I have something written in a playbook that says ping, one of these modules will translate that into a language that our endpoint can understand. Modules aren't just for Cisco. Whoops. There's plenty of modules for things like Aruba or F5s. If we look at the list of network modules, you can see them here. They have things for ACI, A10s, Cisco, Aruba. We're not going to go through all of these, but just know that these resources are out there. If you're trying to create new plays, this is a good resource to have up in the background so you know what commands you're going to need to use when creating these playbooks. So YAML. YAML is a language that Ansible uses to translate what our playbooks say into a language that Ansible can understand. So think of YAML as the programming language, whereas some programs are written in Python. Ansible uses YAML to have those. YAML is basically the programming language of Ansible. There's a couple of data structures that we're going to need to know when we're talking about YAML. And those are lists, dictionaries, and scalars. I'm not going to go too in depth into what lists, dictionaries, and scalars are because there's not that much time to do that. So I'm going to assume you know what lists and dictionaries are. Scalars are just a fancy way of saying strings, integers, and floats. Strings are just a group of alphanumeric characters. Integers you could think of as whole numbers, and floats are integers that include decimal points. So an example of a YAML list would be something like this. It's just a list of items. It could be an array, or it is an array. A dictionary would be something that's comprised of a key and a value. So if I were to say, my name is Danny, name would be the key and the value would be Danny. An important thing to note when using YAML is that lists can be part of dictionaries. So you could have lists within dictionaries and dictionaries within lists. You're going to see this in some of the plays that we use later on in the demo. Okay, so here you'll see a inventory file. I'm actually going to pull up an example of what an inventory is, but you could think of an inventory as a group of devices that we want Ansible to manage. The inventory file could be written in either an INI or a YAML file. It uses either the local host file or DNS on your system. So let's take a look at that, because it's probably easier for you to understand if I pull this up. Okay, so in my host file, this is written in INI rather than YAML. You're going to notice that we have something called Cisco here. And within that Cisco section, we have something called switches and routers. So switches is just going to be a group of all of the switches we have in our host file. And routers are going to be all the routers. For us in particular, these switches are we just have a name here. They're being resolved through the local host file on this box. But if I didn't have them in the host file, they would just be written as such, where it would have Ansible host and then the IP address of that. Like I said, you could also use DNS. So if I didn't have these names in my host file, it would just use the DNS on that actual Ansible box. Inventories are created in a hierarchical structure. They can include all of your devices. So in our example here, I have some wireless stuff, some NXOS devices, some Aruba switches, and a Juniper switch. Each of these devices, you'll also see some of them will have variables here. These variables just tell you how to log into that device or how you want to connect to that device. When you're adding variables to your host file, it can get kind of messy. So there's ways for us to clean this up, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. But there's also ways to organize this a little bit better. So let's say I had devices in the West Coast. I would just create a new section called West Coast, and I can create a child where I would just add already existing groups into that West group. Before I go further, I think I was going kind of quick, so I'll stop for questions if you guys have any up until now. Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so some useful commands when you're looking at your inventory are going to be Ansible inventory -h, which is just going to be a list of your help commands. If you want to look at particular hosts in your inventory, Ansible host is a great command. It'll also give you the variables that are attached with that host. So let's say I wanted to see what credentials were being used in the router 1 device. What I can do is Ansible inventory host router 1. And I can see particular variables that I have for that. So I want it to become enable, which means it's allowed to go into global config. It's connecting with the network CLI, and we know it's an iOS device, and it has a username and password. And then we also added some custom variables, which are the AS number and the BGP router ID. You can add all kinds of variables to this that can be used with some of your scripts. We'll get into that in a little bit. But as I mentioned, when you have variables inside your host file, it can get confusing, especially if you have a large host file. So what is common to do is to create host variables or group variables. So these variable files are written in YAML format, and they help you simplify that inventory. So each group can have its own group variable, or you can have variables set to particular hosts. If we have the same login credentials for all of the routers, then we can just create a group inventory for the routers. So if I look at the routers file, I can see all the variables that I have for all routers. When you're creating a grouped variable, the file name is going to be the name of the group you have. So since I have a group named routers, I'm going to create a group variable file called routers.yaml. Same for switches and all of the other groups in here. An important thing that I want to note is in my file, you're going to see username and passwords here. I don't recommend you do that. This is a lab, so it's not that big of a deal. But when you're doing this in production, there's a way to encrypt all of this stuff using the Ansible Vault. I'm not going to get into details on how to use that just because of time. But if you're going to be using Ansible in production, I recommend that you guys take a look at that. But again, so if I had some hosts that were one-offs that didn't have the same username and password, what I would do is I would create host files or host variable files for those. So I have 2 Nexus devices in my inventory file. What I did is I created groups with those Nexus devices, and I created YAML files for different variables. So I created a variable file with all of the VLAN information. I created a variable file with BGP and login information as well. This is just a way to organize it a little bit better than putting everything in one file. So if you had a lot of details that you needed to put into one of these files, you can break it up into multiple files. But if it was just something simple like login information, you just create a file named the host name. So I have a device called router1. I would just create a router1 host file. So playbooks are the other part that we're going to manage as the Ansible administrator. And playbooks are the meat and potatoes of Ansible. So think of playbooks as the actual program. Like I said, everything is going to be written in YAML or programmed in YAML. Playbooks contain tasks. So tasks are the things that you want to run. So if I wanted to ping a number of devices, I would create a task that says ping. Or if I wanted to pick up information like serial numbers, I would create a task that goes in and audits for serial numbers. Here are a couple of commands that would be helpful. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to get into a lab and take a look at this, because I think it's going to be easier for you guys to kind of understand it. In our demo lab, you're only going to see 6 devices, but that's just because of resources. You can scale this up or scale this down. The playbooks that we're going to be running would work on 6 devices or 6,000 devices. It doesn't really matter. It's all about just resources for the lab. But it's important to remember that the more devices you have, the bigger savings you're going to have in terms of time. But the first playbook that we're going to be running is just a simple ping playbook. So what this is going to do is this is just going to ping some of the devices in our lab. So when you're writing a playbook, all playbooks are, since it's written in YAML, are going to start with 3 hyphens. That's just the structure of a YAML file. Next is going to be the name section. The name section is an optional argument. It just kind of tells you where in your playbook you are. So if I had a number of tasks, I would want to create multiple names just so if I'm watching that play run, I can know what task is being completed. The host part of your playbook is going to define the part of the inventory that you want this play to run again. This is optional. You can either define what devices you want this to run on in your playbook, or you can define it when you're running it. So let's say I didn't have this host section here. When I ran the actual play, I could just say I wanted it to be run on my West Coast routers. Alternatively, you could just have it here. So you always want it to be ran on these devices. The next section is going to be your tasks. So the things that we want to accomplish in this play. In the first example, we just want to ping. So we want to see what devices are up and down. So let's take a look at our first play. So to run an Ansible play, we're just going to do Ansible Playbook and the name of the actual play. In this case, it's just ping our lab. So Ansible is actually pretty verbose, and it gives out a lot of warnings. By default, it gathers facts. This is something you can disable, but I wouldn't be too concerned about these warnings here. Warnings in red might be a little more concerning. In this case, this red warning here is just saying that it failed, and that's because these devices don't actually exist in our lab. We have no Nexus devices right now, and switch 2 is down. But on all of the other devices, we can see that we were able to successfully ping them. And if you actually look at the play itself, it's exactly what was in the PowerPoint. We have the 3 hyphens to define that this is YAML, and then it just gives you a list of what's going on here. It's important to note, this ping right here is just a module. So this is that pre-made script that we just have running against the devices. So our next play is going to grab devices from our lab. So this is a little bit more complicated. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new play. We're going to disable that warning that the gathering facts that Ansible does by itself. And we're going to use the actual module, which is iOS gather facts or iOS facts. Next, we're going to register that to output. And basically what that means is we're going to take the output of gather facts and we're going to assign it to a variable called output. That alone isn't really going to do much for us. So we're going to create a new task that says print this out so that we can read it. So we use the debug module, and within the debug, we're printing this out. We're printing out the output. These curly braces right here is just to define, it's Jenga. Ansible uses Jenga to display items. I wouldn't really be too concerned with Jenga right now, but if you're going to dive deeper into Ansible, it's something you'll need to know. But let's go ahead and test out this playbook. So the first task is grabbing iOS facts, which was the name. So we know exactly what it's doing, and it's using the iOS module to do this. Once it's done, it's going to register that to output, and then it's going to print it out for us. This is kind of too much information for us, though. It's giving us the interfaces that this is on, the bandwidth information of each interface, the serial number, the neighbor information, the memory usage. So this is kind of not useless, but it's too much information for us to go through. In this case, it's only 6 devices, so it's not that bad. But if we were running this against 1,000 devices, this would kind of be useless because it's way too much for us to reasonably look at. So what we would do is we would create a new play and print out just information that we want to see. The reason that we did this first is because we want to know how Ansible is going to spit this information out. So in my case, what I'm doing is I'm doing an audit to find all of the software version and serial number of all of the devices out on our network. So I could see Ansible spits out serial numbers as Ansible net serial number. So I'm going to jot this information down. Next, I'm going to jot down the version information. So we're going to take Ansible net version, and we're going to take note of this. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new play, similar to the first one that we just ran. But rather than spitting out the entire output, what we're going to do is we're going to spit out just the host name, the serial number, and the net version. So we took the same information from here and we replaced output with that variable. Everything else up here is going to be exactly the same. So if we rerun this play, the new version of it, what we're going to see is this in a little bit of a cleaner fashion, something that we would be able to make sense of a little bit faster. Okay, so if I'm doing a network audit, I now have the host name, the serial number, and the version of software that each device on my network is running. I did that in maybe 10 lines of code, not even. Trying to do this manually can take hundreds of hours. So a little bit faster. I actually have one more example for you guys before we end this. Let's say I have a few hundred devices on SNMP version 2, and I'm a little more security conscious, so I want to update that and move to SNMP version 3. So if I take a look at my lab, I have a script that's going to tell me what version of SNMP each device is on. Actually, it's not going to tell me that. It's going to tell me the configuration of SNMP for each device. So it's checking the SNMP server, and we're going to get some output. So now I know that all of my devices are using SNMP version 2. There's no other configuration for SNMP on them. But since I'm moving to SNMP version 3, what I'm going to have to do is create a new playbook for that. And let's take a look at that playbook real quick before we run it. So this one's a little bit more complicated, but it's still not that long. What this is doing is we registered a few variables here. So we're going to have an ACL called SNMP read-only. We're setting our SNMP server to be 10.1.1, and then we're assigning some username, some passwords to the auth and priv. So what this does is it verifies that the ACL exists, and if this ACL SNMP RO does exist, then it's going to add our new NMS server to there, and then it's going to use a couple commands to configure SNMP version 3. So let's run this play. So remember, the name of the task is verify SNMP exists, or the ACL exists. So it's doing that right now, which is just show run and include access list. If it contains that variable, then we know that it exists. So since it existed on these devices, we're going to go ahead and add the new NMS server to that. And then we're going to actually enter in our SNMP version 3 configuration. To make sure that that was actually done, we can use our verify SNMP script. we can see, all these devices were now configured for SNMP version 3. It still has the SNMP version 2 configuration on there. We can just we could either include that in our script that we use to add this, or in this case, I have another script to just remove that. So I can just remove SNMP. So that's going to go ahead and just remove SNMP version 2. This is all I have for you guys, but I wanted to leave you with a few resources where you can go out and get some more information about Ansible. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of information out there for Ansible. The Ansible documentation itself is really helpful. The modules may not have the best information in them, like the specific network modules might not be that detailed, but the Ansible documentation itself is. There's also a section in DevNet that talks about Ansible that can help you get started. And then there's also resources that you can pay for, but that are pretty good. I've recommended Kirk Byers' session to a lot of people at LA Networks, so I would recommend the same to you guys. It's a little bit expensive, but I think it's completely worth it if you want to get started. It's pretty detailed. But yeah, that is it. I will open it up for questions if you guys have any.
If anyone has questions, just a reminder to take yourselves off of mute.
Do you have a tutorial or anything for setting up Ansible and maybe on possibly the Windows subsystem for Linux?
So I think there's a walkthrough on how to set it up on the Ansible website. There's not really that much to it. The only thing that you're going to have to configure is the Ansible configuration file. I think there might be 3 or 4 things in there that you have to actually go in and manually edit. I don't have a walkthrough, but I would be happy to create one and share it with Scug. We could post that up on the website with the PowerPoint.
So any other questions for Daniel or Joe tonight? Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.